Well, good morning, everyone. This is impressive, guys. You've got a packed out room. You happy?
Very.
Indeed.
Are you happy? Guys, I'm going to need more energy. It's the first panel. Are you happy?
There we go.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, we've heard be bold a lot. It was part of my wardrobe agreement, be bold in pink. Didn't realize I'd be blending in with the Latitude59 team. Anyway, I'm Cathy White. I'll be hosting this session with, as said previously, two legendary individuals from the world of startup and venture. Now, before I get them to introduce themselves, I'd like you to introduce yourselves. So just so we get a sense of who is in the room here today, would you mind raising your hand if you are part of a startup? Keep it up if you're a founder. Okay. Anyone here also working in VC? All right, now who here is from Estonia? Who here is from Europe? And anyone here not from Europe? Okay, guys, we've got a good crowd in here. All right. Staffan, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about you and Creandum?
So first of all, thanks for having us. Tallinn is one of my favorite cities in Europe. I think it's amazing what's happening here. So I've been in the industry, in the venture industry for 25 years. I was in the Bay Area, summer of '99, and I realized that the world was changing. I wanted to bring what they were doing in the US to Europe. Took a couple of years to get us started, but I think now we're really on a roll. Creandum is a venture firm. We're 22 years old. Pan-European, invest in founders, seed and A, all across Europe. I think we've invested in 25 different countries.
Wow, very cool. Sten, going to ask you to do the same.
Yes, hey, I'm Sten, lifelong software entrepreneur from here in Estonia, but lived around the world a bit. And since 2.5 years ago, we started this new venture platform called Plural, where our aim is to have very experienced founders and operators to back the next very ambitious younger founders. And we raised some external money for the first time to do that as well. We just closed our second fund and operate between Tallinn and London.
Awesome. All right, so for today, we're going to dive into what's going on in the European ecosystem and how we can compete more with the US. I'm going to ask you both just in turn, just to get a bit of a view on the past in terms of what Europe has achieved so far to bring us to where we are today. Obviously, Staffan, you mentioned you've been doing this for over 20 years. What have you seen change in Europe?
Well, I think to be fair, when I started in '99, there was the internet boom, and we thought things would happen very fast. They didn't. We had the big bust. We raised our first fund in 2002, and I had 2 LPs. And then I fundraised for another year, did not raise a single dollar more. And I think that is how little people believed in the ecosystem. But steadily, but slowly, it has developed, and we looked into the 20-year history when we turned 20 a year and a half ago, and we saw that Europe has gone from 5 to 25% of global early-stage founding. And we saw that back in 2010, there were only 3 unicorn cities in Europe. Last year, there were 65 in 25 different countries. So just a couple of data points on how this ecosystem, I think, has exploded, really.
Yeah. And Sten, same question, but I'd also love for you to tell us a little bit more about what you've seen specifically here in Estonia. From the outside world looking in, it's always nicely positioned as the land of the unicorn.
Yeah, so I think in that sense, Estonia is basically the minimum viable country. So if you can build a startup ecosystem here, you can use that model and believe in other places. And so if you look at 2005, when Skype was the big first exit and eBay acquired Skype, and if you start counting from that, in 2006, the total VC investments in the country were $6 million. Next year, it dropped.
Wow.
And in 2022, I think we hit the peak of 1.3 billion a year. So you can see that this has been completely explosive. There is 10 unicorns, there's 1,400 teams building. There is more than 1% of the working population in this country works in startups. And we're having a multi-point impact on the GDP of the country, which is pretty abnormal on the global scale. And what I take from that is that you need to have the first success stories You need to create the generation of people who have built a scale-up company, know that they can build global things without leaving their home country, which is a case in many other sort of sources of talent where people feel the need to move to Silicon Valley to build something, not here. And you also need to have this sort of people either have made some money, or they know people who have made some money, or they have the credibility or the past stories to go and bring capital into the country. And so we've had all of those happen in Estonia, and I'm extremely bullish that we can do that in Europe overall.
Yeah, I personally love the way that you describe yourselves on Plural. I like the term used, the unemployables.
Yes, and we're only half joking.
So where are we at right now? You know, the last couple of years, particularly in lieu of the pandemic, obviously there was a lovely peak in the amount of money going into startups, and then the big drop down come end of 21 into 22. Where are we at this very moment? You know, are you feeling confident about venture and startups in this ecosystem? Staffan?
So I think, you know, there's been 2 relatively tough years. Funding to the startups, funding to the funds. I think that's starting to change. We saw that M&A was picking up last fall. There was actually an exit here in our portfolio, Klaus, Estonian company, only a couple of months ago. Mm-hmm. We're seeing the first couple of IPOs coming. That always starts in the US. I think Europe will hopefully follow. We have 8 companies in our portfolio. 6 of them are headquartered in Europe, 2 in the US that are preparing for IPO. So I think 25 will be a pretty interesting year. But I think it's more important to actually look at the longer time horizon, right? Because again, going back 25 years, Europe was basically nothing. We actually started an office in San Francisco, and you know, that's how we got to know each other, almost 15 years ago. And why did we start that? Because so many European entrepreneurs felt that they had to go to the US to build their companies. Then comes this young guy starting a music company in the southern suburbs of Stockholm called Spotify, who said, hey, screw that, I'm going to build it from here. And I think that, together with Skype and 1 or 2 other companies, really set the tone for how European entrepreneurs are building today. Mm-hmm. They can do it from here.
They can do it from here. So in terms of doing it from here, is there anything else? I'm sure maybe there's potentially a lot of things that, you know, within Europe we need to do in order to compete with the US. I'd love to get your thoughts on anything that the ecosystem needs for success. Sten?
I think there are 2 things there. One is this sort of entire mindset of competing. It's, on some level it makes sense, on other levels like it's kind of pointless, like Europe should do Europe. Mm-hmm. The way I look at ecosystems development is that if you have this pyramid of startups, that there is like a bottom activity, there are like 2 girls and an idea, and they are starting something in a garage, and sort of it's moving up the chain, and then on top you have IPOs and exits and all of that. Every ecosystem starts developing bottom up. You first have, like, one of the metrics you can think about is like how far do you have to travel to raise how much money, like in venture terms. And so Estonia crossed this point of, like, for a 200, 500K angel round, you don't need to go anywhere. You can do it in Tallinn or Tartu 20 years ago. And now, a few years ago, I was part of a Estonian-led 20 million euro deal where all the emails were in Estonian. So you can see that happening. It will take a decade or 2, but you can move up that chain. And the activity on that lower rungs in Europe is amazing. Europe will create 25,000 new tech companies in the next 5 years. 5,000 a year. 5,000 a year are created by unique repeat founders. They built something before, so the probability of the next thing succeeding goes even up. 5,000 in Europe, 4,000 in the US. If you look at sort of the activity of company creation, early stage rounds, the number of cities, as Staffan said, the number of cities where you don't need to travel anywhere to build and to get started and all of that has grown up. And that means that Europe's problems are shifting up as well. It's fine to raise 10, 20, 50 million here. When you need 200 million, when Bolt needs 600 million, then you call America. and it used to be that you call US or China. Now, for geopolitical reasons, we don't call that, right? So it's very much that. How do we solve for later stage capital? How do we get European pension funds to invest in this asset class of early tech companies? How do we create viable IPO markets? So many people forget like that behind these US multi-trillion-dollar companies, very often there is very strong European stories. Like what would be Google's valuation today if DeepMind wasn't founded in London? But the question is that how do we create the next DeepMinds in a way that they don't have to sell to Google in their year 2 or 3, but they can grow and sort of scale across Europe? And I think there is, like, among those sort of centi unicorns that Europe has created, I think there is a lot of material of founders with that ambition, founders with that mindset, and it's about like giving them now the tools and the ecosystem and the capital to go for it.
Yeah. Staffan, there's a lot of nodding, which is good to see. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, maybe that the pyramid that Sten describes, that I like a lot, over time becomes a circle. And the reason it becomes a circle is that the people that have moved up the pyramid, made money, they start paying it forward. They start to angel invest, they start to invest in funds like ours. They start to advise, they build ecosystem like the one here in Tallinn that you guys have done an amazing job. And then this becomes the virtuous circle. And then that circle starts to spin faster and faster. And I actually don't want to compare too much against or with the US because I think Europe is actually building something that is unique. But their circle has been spinning for 20, 25 years longer than ours. And that's actually one of the key reasons why when we sometimes compare, we think, oh, the US is better. It's actually not. It's just further ahead in this development.
It's interesting. One interesting moment that, like, we all know that in the 21, 22, it wasn't the post-COVID world that changed this sort of tech creation landscape, but it was free money. So money didn't cost anything, and so money got access to projects that maybe it wouldn't anymore these days. So it's this sort of, if you look at the curve of investments in early stage tech, and you remove this 21, 22, and skip from like year 19 to 23, US dropped about 1% in growth, China dropped 9%, and Europe still grew 18%. So it's also, like to Staffan's point, like if somebody's ahead of you on that curve, like on higher absolute numbers, the growth rates start to go down. So we're still like, we're coming from behind, but we're growing faster. And that means one thing, like the gap is reducing.
And we're actually not only growing faster. There was interesting data released only half a year ago from Cambridge Associates, where they looked at the average venture returns between the US and in Europe. And frankly, when I started 25 years ago, if a pension fund had committed to a European venture fund, they would hide that in the bottom of their balance sheet. And I see a lot of people here nodding because we've been in this system for a long time, right? They would hide it, the bottom of their balance sheet, under miscellaneous, right? And European venture capital, that was like a bad word for US endowments, etc. I mean, today we're both raising from some of the best sources of capital in the world, US endowments, foundations, etc. And they do that for a reason. And that reason is that the European venture returns are now better than the American ones on a 5-year horizon, a 10-year horizon, and a 20-year horizon.
It's great. I mean, what's so lovely here is there's so much actually to be very positive about and confident in. And personally, it's really refreshing to hear the let Europe do Europe perspective as well, because so often Europe is compared to either the US or even China, right? So, you know, to bring it back to two key words for the conference this year, which are connection and responsibility, what more can we, the Europeans in the room and our lovely friends, do to continue to foster growth in the ecosystem? This could be policy, it could be founders doing what they can with their teams. What do you think would be really good for the ecosystem, focusing on Europe doing Europe?
I think to bring out a little bit more detail in that Europe doing Europe, the way I see this sort of the big defined technology conflict of this coming decade is very clearly US versus China. Like it's in geopolitics, it's in security, it's in safety, it's in capital movement, all of these things. But if you look at sort of the nature of technology and you look at the human values, the sort of what are encapsulated in technologies created in these two places, like Chinese sort of communist authoritarian dictatorship, basically, is creating technologies where everything belongs to the state. Like if you're a citizen, if you're a user, your data belongs to the Communist Party, basically, in simplified terms. US, with a hyper-liberal or libertarian market economy from European perspective, is everything is led by very strong private companies. So you have 5 or 6 or 7 or $10 trillion companies that are publicly listed, and people don't trust to have a government ID, but they will easily get the Meta ID and the Google ID, and all of these private companies have their data and all of that. So I think where Europe, and often us Europeans view it wrong, is that European role is to sort of turn inside and sort of create some protectionist system where there's like a lot of the European regulation around technology is about how do we protect Europe. Like how do we not allow American companies here or not allow Chinese money here and like all of these things. In reality, I think it's that actually the flip side of that is the positive vision, is that the world outside needs European technologies. Because we are creating technologies which are citizen-owned, where you own your data, where privacy is valued, like all of these things. We have learned the hard way here in Estonia as well. Like, why do you need cybersecurity? Like we've had active attacks since 2007, so it's like real. When we build those technologies, people in Brazil, Canada, but also in US and China and Malaysia and like most of Africa will be needing that kind of technologies. And that is the sort of the expansionist, like how do we export the European humanist values to the world? And the only way a country's GDP grows, if you bring money home from outside, which means you bring value to the world, the only way Europe grows is if you take European values and take those outside and get paid from outside. Like circulating money inside Estonia or inside Europe or inside Sweden doesn't like make anybody like grow. Really, it's just redistribution. So I think that's the sort of the mindset. And what's beautiful is that so many European founders that Europe as a whole is a much larger market than US with like 500 million plus people versus US 350. But every European founder, when they grow up in Sweden or Estonia or Czech Republic or like 2/3 of European countries, they come from a small place. They can't afford to build for their home market, so they think global, and that's super useful.
Yeah. Staffan, anything from your side in terms of what Europe can do to be Europe?
So I think you're pointing to some of the key points. I would probably add two. One is that we should make sure that we don't sell our companies too early. Mm-hmm. Historically, European companies have been sold to American counterparts too early. Entrepreneurs haven't always made money. GPs like us have been immature and felt the pressure from the pension funds, the endowments, etc. Some of that I think we are fixing, but as a mindset, I think we should all in this room let these companies grow longer and not press for liquidity, exit, etc. Because that is again what creates the pyramid, and the pyramid becomes a circle. I was also extremely excited to hear from you this morning how this country is leading the way in terms of policy and evolution. And I actually think this is a pretty important one. We have the fundamentals. We have 500 million very ambitious people, but we need to work on the framework. And I had lunch with Marcus from Bolt a couple of weeks ago, and we discussed the pace of policy change in a country like Sweden versus Estonia. And I said, hey, in Sweden, it takes 10, 15 years to get a policy changed if you think it's wrong. And then I said, well, here, I sort of go to the government, and if they think it's a great idea, it takes sort of 6, 7, 8 weeks. And Estonia can lead the way in Europe by being agile. Yeah. You also cannot get complacent, right? This is actually what happened to Sweden. So Sweden and the other Nordic countries, we were 50% of the unicorns in Europe 15 years ago. And everyone sort of thought, oh, we were so good. But it's continuously a race. And you need to evolve policy, infrastructure, etc. And you have a chance to stay at the lead with policy.
It's incredibly impressive, says the British person on the corner.
6 weeks, that's Estonia.
That's very, very, very impressive. So just a reminder to everyone in the room here, you have got the ability to ask Stan and Staffan questions as well. So if you follow one of the things that will pop up on the screen, you can use VoteMo and shoot your questions up here, and I will attempt to ask them. Staffan, last night when I saw you, we were briefly talking about talent in Europe and potentially, the good side of what can come from immigration in terms of making sure that we have got the right people here to build those companies. Would love to get your thoughts on what more we can do to make sure that we're winning and bringing the best people here.
Does anyone here in the audience know where Steve Jobs' dad was from?
Yell it out.
Exactly. He was a Syrian professor. Does anyone think that he would get a visa to the US today?
No.
Right? Immigration is great for what we do. Let's embrace it because it brings in people that are talented and super ambitious. It is just great. You mentioned the number of 500 and the 340, 330, 350 in the US. At the base, talent is distributed according to this bell curve. So if you take our 500 million people, you add immigration, I would say that Europe has a 2x talent advantage versus the US. They are not smarter than us, right? They're not more ambitious. It's the same, right? And we have a 2x advantage. Let's embrace that.
It's numbers-wise, like last year was, again, a breakthrough year. And I think the US elections coming this November, and if you listen to how they talk about immigration now, basically, if you're an Indian PhD in software and you want to move to Silicon Valley, then in 2 years you will get an embassy appointment.
Wow.
If you're a PhD data scientist who wants to move to the real Bay Area, the finest Bay Area, and your company is a tech startup in Estonia, then you can get hired on Friday and start work on Monday. Like you deal with this embassy stuff in a digital society already later. So like that level, and I think most of the world hasn't realized that gap yet. But last year the numbers were European tech migration, net migration was 100,000 people more than to the US. Because not even that you get blocked, but also this uncertainty doesn't actually work. Like if you're deciding where to move your family, like do you move to a place where the signals are that we don't really want you here? You pick the place that wants you. And the other thing that was interesting is that the hottest thing right now in tech is AI. And so I saw some numbers about AI researchers and engineers. In European Union, they counted 127,000 people dealing with AI as their job. And in US, it was 86,000. So there are like these things that people kind of assume that happens in the US. And of course, if you go to San Francisco today, like the most amazing top people in sort of machine learning, the sort of open AIs and Anthropics, and these people are there. The average quality of meetups per every week, that's higher. But the talent, it doesn't mean the talent is not there in Europe. It's more about how do we leverage that talent, how do we consolidate that talent, how do we give ambition to that talent, rather than how do we, like, that we need to create that talent. These people are already here.
Yeah. One thing I'm personally very curious about, and you were just talking about the ambition side of things, but if we're looking at how Europe continues to grow and scale over the coming decades, it's not just about the talent that we can bring in, it's about the talent, the future talent that we can nurture.
Sure.
So how do we inspire the next generation to continue to build on what we've already done within tech? I'd love to get your thoughts just in terms of what more we can do, potentially quite literally with kids, those heading to university perhaps, to show them the best of tech.
I think it's about role models. You know, there's many here in the room. One of them is here on stage with me. When we looked into the 20-year report, we also looked at how many kids that the big successful startups have. And Sten, by the way, I know you looked into this for Skype as well. How many kids does Skype have today? Startups coming out of the Skype ecosystem.
Oh, I thought literal kids. That was.
How many people
I'm sure
have
that's
babies?
also a big number.
But I think in the 20 years of Skype, we created 996 companies.
There you go.
From the alumni of Skype employees and the alumni of the, like, somebody goes, Tavet goes from Skype and creates Wise, and people go from Wise and create Lightyear, and so the sequence continues.
Exactly. And when we looked at this, we looked at Spotify, iSettle, Adyen, Klarna, etc. And on average, these companies and the role models, they create 50 to 80 kids in the first 10 years. And then this accelerates, of course, because some of those kids have grandkids, etc. So it's all about role models, because if you start working at Skype or Spotify, etc., you will work alongside some amazing people. But some of these younger people will say, hey, Daniel Ek or Marcus Willig, they are great. But you know what? So am I. Mm-hmm. If they can do it, I can do it. It's just that they did not realize that until they were in that environment. So celebrating these role models, not too much so they get cocky, right? But celebrating it, celebrating success, that will then multiply.
I wrote this down. It took 26 minutes through this panel to mention AI for the first time, which I think is quite impressive given the impact that it's having right now. Even in the last week, we had a new 200 million round of funding into a French AI startup, and that was a seed round, which is mad. Anyway, the reason I bring that up is because I've got a question from the audience for you, which is, how will AI change the VC industry over the coming 3 to 5 years? Any thoughts on AI and its impact in VC?
The share of capital going directly to NVIDIA goes up?
Yes, NVIDIA is doing really well.
No, I mean, there are firms, and I don't think neither of ours is in that category, that are trying hard to automate and sort of figure out how do you source startups, how do you detect who's going to win, all of that. So far, like when Google started Google Ventures, maybe 10, 15 years ago, they borrowed some people from the search team, which Google search team is pretty decent in machine learning, right? And so they took all the data they can about the startups to date, who was funded, who won, what was the backgrounds, what was the blood type, what was the education of the founders, what the other things happened on the way, pulled all of the data together and then tried to find the patterns. And the team crunched the numbers and came back and said, we found it. The most important predictor of startup success is timing. So basically, right now there is no signal that so the machine learning and crunching large data sets would beat the act of two people working together or two organizations working together. And that's why in Plural model, kind of to Staffan's point earlier, that if the European ecosystem is a decade or two behind the US, now we only have these generations of the founders that are coming out and building their success stories. They're thinking of how to give back. And so with Plural, we're trying to create the mechanism where these sort of experienced founders have this direct interface, and they can find and work with the most ambitious next generation founders and help them grow. And so a lot of this, it's interesting, it's like the VC industry is operating in a very high-tech world, but on the basic level, it's very much a human interactions, sort of spending time with each other, passing on the knowledge and all of these things. And I think what we see today is that machine learning mostly helps us to just deal with this overflow of data, like processing a few thousand decks a year, or structuring data, or finding sort of what did we talk about with that person in that week, and like a lot of this data management and search are the first use cases. But
yeah.
So for full disclosure, we were part of that 200 million euro seed round.
Oh, well done.
Yeah, it's the biggest seed round we've ever done. You sort of feel pretty nervous just by talking about it. But hey, I think, again, taking the time perspective here, these new areas, AI, crypto, mobile internet, metaverse, Web 2.0, Web 3.0, these come and go, right? Mm-hmm. Is AI different? Yes and no. It is a fantastic opportunity to build great companies, and I think it's a fantastic area to invest in. Will there be something else in 3, 4, 5 years? Just like crypto was huge, still is huge, 5, 10 years ago? Absolutely, right? So I think that, yes, it'll be great, but you know, it's sort of not the end of the world, or the beginning of something new. Now, on the end of the world, a lot of people are saying, oh, It's going to take away jobs. It's going to create unemployment. And yes, to some extent, some type of jobs will disappear. But who remembers Spinning Jenny here, right? Spinning Jenny, way, way back, the workers were destroying the machines, they were tearing down the factories, etc. You know, this is sort of normal. New innovations come, they make things more efficient, the world moves on, people find new things to do.
I think the funniest thing with job dynamics that has happened in the last 2 years with the large language models, and because they're very text and knowledge centric, is that maybe 5 years ago there was somebody defined a framework that if you look at jobs at Uber or Bolt, there are jobs that are above the API and below the API. Below the API are when the app tells you where you need to drive, and above the API is that when you're creating the app. And everybody thought 5 years ago that the jobs we're going to disrupt first and replace first are the jobs under the API, self-driving cars and no drivers and like all of that. In 2 years that has flipped. I think we're replacing jobs above the API faster, like a single developer having 10 times more productivity, somebody who can't really code, like can build further without. So it's like this dynamic is constantly shifting, and that's not the last shift. So I think it's,
exactly.
And the other thing is that we recently invested in a robotics company that builds walls, brick walls, and the real situation in so many markets like construction or healthcare or nursing, and is that it's the demand for new homes in Netherlands is 100,000 homes a year.
Yeah.
There are people to lay brick walls for 70,000 a year. So it's like the first instances of this, so the machine learning powered, very sort of advanced human replacing categories can fill the gaps where we don't have humans for. Or we have a company in Denmark, Teton, that helps elderly care. Again, if we're lacking medical nurses, like injecting more machine learning, more AI into those industries actually provides services to people who can't afford them today because there are not enough people to provide them.
Yeah. So earlier on in our conversation, Staffan, you touched on the fact that, 2025, we're going to be looking at more IPOs, hopefully more exits. I'd love to get both of your thoughts while we've got a few minutes left on any other predictions that you might have over the next kind of 3 to 5 years. If you had to place a bet, if you're gambling men, what would you bet on happening in the coming time?
Try to be very careful on predictions because we're usually wrong. But I think
that's fine. It's a prediction.
Fine. I think the exit markets are coming back in full swing. I think that's pretty clear. I think there's one area where I think Europe will really progress and do well, and it is within climate. And within climate, I think we have a massive opportunity in electrification. So in Norway, they announced data only 2 weeks ago. 90% of all new cars are fully electric, and the fleet passed the threshold of being 50-50 fossil and electric. And by the way, as a side comment, I think Estonia, given how forward-looking the country is, you guys could be the first country in the world that goes completely electric. You're not driving east, right? Country is relatively small, range is not going to be an issue. I know the production of that electricity is sort of an issue, but just think about it. It could be the first country in the world. So I think this is an area where Europe can really dominate. That's my #1 prediction. Okay.
Sten, any predictions?
Well, you said we're often wrong, but at the same time, we're betting a lot of money on some of those things. But we are wrong. One thing, on a macro level, one thing that I'm tracking is like, if as I said before, that Estonia has had GDP level impact from startups. So that's how we think about it in Plural as well. How can we create GDP level impact in Europe? And then you start asking yourself, like, what does it mean? I think the total valuation of all European tech companies is like 18% of European GDP, but the valuation to GDP, like, maybe not the right measure. So, but let's take the top 30 largest tech companies in the world. That gives you about companies valued for 100 and something billion and up. There's 30 of them. Most of them are in the US. There are 2 European companies on that list. And one is ASML and one is SAP. One is very heavily enterprise, and the other one is sort of a beautiful natural monopoly in chip production, so let's create more of those. But if you create one more European company on that list of top 30 companies in the world, then you've had GDP level impact.
Exactly.
So it's kind of like from one side, it's a big task. It feels like ambitious and sort of exciting to work on. But at the same time, I believe it's super achievable. So I don't know if we'll get there by 5 years, like 2030, but like in the next decade, like I think adding one or two of 100 billion plus European companies on the largest companies list in the world. Doable.
And I think we can do it. And to my previous point, let's make sure that we as an ecosystem, investors, entrepreneurs, LPs, pension funds, and so on, give these companies the time to get there. Because as you said, if there's one thing that Europe lacks so far, it's that Google or Facebook. Maybe Bolt is that company. Maybe it's a fintech out of Germany or somewhere else, right? Or Budapest. It can happen, but we need to give it time and we need to be patient and not sell these companies to the Americans as we have done too much historically.
And the obvious question for the rest of the society is I think one danger that we sometimes have is that in any society, including Estonia, you will have this sort of kids in downtown offices with sort of saunas and pool. But what does it matter for the rest of the society? But this entire venture industry and the tech creation operates on a power law, which means that per every peak is sort of on an exponential curve. So if we create 100 billion euro company, that probably on the way we accidentally create 10 billion companies, we probably create 100 unicorns. In Europe, there are 2.3 million people working in tech who are usually making 2 or 3x higher salaries. So they pay more taxes, and then you can hire teachers and nurses and all of those other groups who are not dealing with tech, but everybody benefits. So this sort of spillover is actually why this matters. It's not about like making one person or one founder rich or something like that. This is how Europe as a sort of overall society will actually survive and grow.
We should all have more kids, is what you're saying.
Well, I think that's a lovely note to end on and brings us back full circle to connection and responsibility. On that note, please join me in a round of applause for our wonderful panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sten. I'll go around this way.